We begin with chapter 6 in Curious Questions on the Meaning of Life with Qohelet. יש רעה אשר ראיתי תחת השמש, ורבה היא על הדם. איש אשר ייתן לו אלוהים, עושר נכסים וכבוד, ואיננו חסר לרשע מכל אשר יתבע. יש ליתנו אלוהים לכל ממנו, כי איש נכריח לנו, זה הבל וחולי ראוי. אם יוליד איש מאה, ושנים רבות יחיה ורב שיהיו ימי שנה, ונפשו לא תשבע מן הטובה, וגם קבורה לא הייתה לו. אמרתי, טוב ממנו הנפל, כי בהבל בא בחושך ילך, ובחושך שמו יכוסה. גם שמש לא ראה ולא ידע נחת לזה מזה. ואילו חיה 1000 שנים פעמיים, וטובה לא רעה לו, אל מקום אחד הכל הולך, כל עמל האדם לפיהו, וגם הנפש לא תמלא. כי מה יותר לחכם מן הכסיל, מה לעני יודע להלוך נגד החיים. טוב מראה עיניים מהלך, נפש גם זה הבל ורעות רוח. ממה שהיה כבר נקרא שמו, ונודע שהוא אדם, ולא יוכל לדין אם שתקיף ממנו. כי יש דברים הרבה מהרבים ההבל, מה יותר לאדם, כי מי יודע מה טוב לאדם בחיים. מספר ימי חייהם לא ויעשם קצר, אשר מי יגיד לאדם מה יהיה אחריו תחת השמש. So that's chapter 6. We're now going to have Bev read it for us on the screen share in the English together. And then we'll have some time for questions and observations that you may have.
Okay. There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is heavy upon humankind. One whom God gives wealth and possessions and honor, and of all that one desires lacks nothing for oneself. Yet God does not grant one to enjoy it, for a stranger will enjoy it. This is mere breath and an evil sickness. If one begot 100 children and lived many years, so that the days of his years are many, that person might not be sated with good things, and even be robbed of a proper burial. I said, better to be stillborn. For in mere breath did it come, and into darkness it goes, and in darkness its name is covered. The very sun it did not see or know, more ease for it than for anyone. And were one to live 1,000 years, twice told, yet good things one did not enjoy, does not everything go to a single place? All one's toil is for one's mouth, yet one's appetite will not be filled. For what advantage has the wise over the fool? What good is it for the poor person to know how to get round among the living? Better what the eyes see than desire going round. This too is mere breath and hurting the wind. What was, has already been called by name and is known, as it is foreknown what a human truly is. Neither can such a being contend with one more powerful. For there are many words that increase mere breath. What is human, the better. For who knows what is good for a human in their life? In all the days of mere breath, for one spends them like a shadow. Who can tell a human what will be afterwards under the sun?
Wonderful. Okay, so let's take a look here. Maybe the message isn't so wonderful, but let's take a look now and see if you have any observations or questions before I share a couple reflections. What do you notice here that's going on in chapter 6 that maybe is unusual or perhaps provocative or disturbing? Remember that part of Qohelet's program is to provoke us and to challenge us. There may actually be some things that you are seeing here that feel cliched. Remember, we talked a little bit about the usage of cliche last time together, and that that Qohelet isn't afraid to peddle in cliche, because there is a sense that cliche actually has a lot of truth value embedded in it, and the more that we hear something, sometimes the more that that it sinks in. The one thing I just want to say as you're formulating any observations or questions you have is the following. That is that chapter 5 that we looked at last time, in many ways is considered to be a thematic section. It went from chapter 5, verse 9 to right until chapter 6, verse 9. And it really focuses in on wealth and poverty. And then in chapter 6, the structures that we see and that we're looking at, verses 1 through 6, focus on negative cases. Verses 7 through 9 focus on Proverbs. And then, really, if you look at the whole unit from chapter 6 all the way through to chapter 8, verse 17, that we'll get to eventually, there's an overall critical discussion of conventional wisdom and a critique of wisdom, what it means to be wise and what it means to enjoy good things in life. And so I just wanted to bring that to your attention. That's kind of the overall structure that's working here. But what do you notice, or what is it that you would like to bring up as a question for us to consider in this opening of chapter 6 together? And
Well,
it
you
may
already
also be some of the translations and the differences you notice in your translation to the one that the one that I proposed. Bev, what did you notice?
you've already alluded to this, but 1 through 6 is very dark. So
Hmm.
you have evil, and he talks about disease, and he talks about stillborn and darkness, and never seeing the sun. So you have a very bleak picture.
Hmm.
Is what's going to happen if you don't do something else, or is this just part of living that you have to acknowledge is there and you have to learn to deal with it?
Well, I think it's a good question. Chapter 6 arguably is one of the darkest chapters of the whole book. So, Bev, that's a very good observation. And I think it goes back to the question we looked at earlier, which is that once Qohelet lays out this observation of, of life under the sun, and what human life is like. And remember, under the sun means in this world and the things in the physical, empirical world that we can navigate and understand with our senses. And anything beyond the sun for Kohelet is the realm where Elohim, where God exists. And they're very separate realms. And as a creature in the world, we're very aware and exposed to our creatureliness, what the great survivor poet Paul Celan called creaturelichkeit. It's this vulnerability that we have as creatures, and this is definitely the darkest of the chapters, right? Especially re-evoking this argument about whether or not, as Shakespeare said in Hamlet, to be or not to be, that is the question. This is a very ancient question that wasn't original to Shakespeare at all. It actually goes right back to Kohelet, and then later on, the rabbinic period becomes a debate between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai that we looked at before together. I mentioned from the Talmud in Eruvin 13a. Is it better for a human being to live, or would it be better off if we were never born? And that's an argument that goes on in all seriousness many centuries after Kohelet. And eventually, if you recall, the upshot was that Beit Hillel was able to win the argument 2.5 years into it with Beit Shammai. And even though the arguments that it would be better off not to be born, that is to be stillborn, were very strong on the part of Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel said, but even if your argument is very strong, now that we're created, as Bev said, what are we going to do with this life? How are we going to make it meaningful? How are we going to embrace goodness? How are we going to allow for there to be enjoyment? And it's a very stark message that Kohelet is moving through here. And I want to spend a few moments talking about what you've just touched on. That's really in the first 6 verses. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But that's a great observation. Other things that you noticed or questions, queries, or observations? Morton?
Well, you had just said never to be born is the same as being stillborn. But when I was reading this book, it struck. I was really taken back by the notion of it's better to be stillborn. When I had read when I can't remember where it was. I was trying to find it but couldn't quickly. Never to have been born. I always imagine that to mean never to have been conceived, never to have
Right.
existed at all.
Hmm.
And that doesn't seem quite as bad as the statement to have been stillborn, which is really dark,
Yeah.
is much.
It is, but we have to, I mean, it's meant to be disturbing and provocative, and I'll come back to it in a moment to unpack it. But I want to just take you to the Hebrew. If you look at verse 3, it literally is speaking about a stillborn. Naphel is a stillborn. So Qohelet is meant to is using provocative language for a reason. And even though logically you're saying, well, maybe it would be better not to be conceived at all than to be conceived
No,
and
no,
to be stillborn.
no, I think previously, when it previously says never to have been born, does it also use in Hebrew, is it also stillborn?
Which verse are you referring to?
Well, that's the part I couldn't,
Oh, okay.
that's the part I couldn't find, but you had just said that,
Yeah,
you were just.
in verse 3 it says Tobi menu hanafel, it's better to be stillborn. And then that comes up I think again a little later on, but it's specifically using the language of the stillborn.
Okay.
And we'll talk about that in a moment because it's quite disturbing and it's meant to be disturbing and provocative. Marianne?
Right. Is there a parallel in the image that he's using? So he starts off talking about evil, but the evil itself, on first glance, you think it's human beings behaving in an, he's seeing evil action, but the evil is actually what is denied mankind, that we shouldn't, that pleasure can't be derived from these things.
That's right.
And then he relates it to being the life of, if we see stillborn almost metaphorically, and then in the phrase that he uses that's repeated, the mere breath, almost existence like an animal existence rather than a intellectual existence, a physical rather than a spiritual or intellectual one. Is he making a connection between what's denied humankind and an existence without connection to the divine?
I think it's very interesting the way that the chapter opens up is that you're right. You would initially, when you hear the word evil, you think about it in terms of what it is that human beings do to each other, right? But what he's suggesting is that what I see in this world under the sun, that is human existence, it's an evil experiment in a sense by a God who is distant and very removed from what's going on. I see, remember we talked about the injustice, how the poor is oppressed. Qohelet sees all these things and he says that's evil. And how it's possible, this is a classic moment of theodicy, which we're going to see every chapter comes back again. Theodicy means it's the supposition, how is it possible for there to be an omnibenevolent God, that is a God who is all good, all knowing and all powerful, who creates a world in which there is suffering. So Qohelet is looking at it now back and back towards this distant God who is supposed to be omnibenevolent, and he says this is just evil. I look at what goes on in the world and how much suffering there is, and from my perspective, it's just outright evil. It's completely, and it's another way he might say it is in the context is it's unjust, but he actually says that it's evil. So let's go back now to look at the case of the stillborn for a moment, and then we'll take a few more questions, observations. The first thing is that when you touched on this, I think in a poignant way, Marian, is that in verses 1 through 3, part of what we see is that suffering is part and parcel of life. That's also what Qohelet is suggesting, in a sense, is part of the evil, especially if we inflict it on each other. But even if just a person suffers for being human, for being born into a body that degenerates and ultimately that leads us to leave this world and return to the earth, it seems like a cruel experiment. And the problem is with human beings, Qohelet is saying, is that we only augment our suffering through the anxiety that comes with knowing that if we're not suffering now, we will be suffering soon. And when we suffer, we ask all these questions, why me? So Qohelet is saying part of the reason why we suffer is because as human beings, we think too much about it. We're different than animals who cannot think about and make meaning of their suffering, which we talked about last time. What distinguishes human beings from animals is that we can make meaning of our suffering, right? Remember, that was what I spoke about last time. Um, in logotherapy, Viktor Frankl's experiences from Auschwitz taught him that the ones who survived were the ones who were able to make meaning. It didn't matter how many crusts of bread you had, but if you made meaning out of your suffering, there was a higher probability from what he saw that you would survive. Um, and so Qohelet is now turning back again and saying that, you work hard, you become wealthy, you're admired by many, but we all know that the cost is too high, and it's a question of whether it's really even worth it. Because what time really remains to ultimately be able to enjoy your success? You spend your days chasing after uh, what is merest breath. You're trying to grasp onto it. And the fear of loss really crowds out any enjoyment of what you've gained, right? We're so anxious that we cannot even enjoy what it is that we've worked so hard to be able to achieve. And and then in verse 3, the pessimism about life really becomes quite pronounced. It's quite striking, right? You can beget many offspring, and of course it's an exaggeration, but we're talking about Qohelet, who also is wearing the mask of King Solomon. And so King Solomon had a harem of many wives, and so you could say not only did he have all the greatest um, the greatest amount of material possessions in his reach. He had health, he had wealth, he had power, and he could have even feasibly have given birth to 100 offspring. Doesn't matter how many offspring you give birth to; they could even live a long time. This still is not going to protect you against a tragic demise, right? Not having enjoyed one's material benefits accrued through all those years of toil, and finally being subjected to the ignominy of remaining exposed to the elements unburied without a shred of dignity. It's a horrible, pessimistic, and dark vision. But he's saying there's no guarantee in life. Even look at the greatest king of all of Israel, the wisest, the wealthiest, the healthiest, the greatest harem. It doesn't matter. That's no guarantee of anything. You could ultimately end up like, um, uh, you know, a John Doe at the side of the road without even the dignity of a proper burial, which is the greatest travesty in Jewish life. So he's also challenging the conventions of Jewish piety, right? One of the greatest things already, even within the biblical period, the Kohelet is navigating is it's important to have dignity of burial. It's important to be buried with your ancestors, and it's important to know that there is kavod hamet. There's a sense of dignity, and the rabbis after the close of the canon of the Bible go into great detail as to how it is that we bury and we mourn our dead with dignity. And Kohelet is saying that's not even guaranteed. So it's very, very disturbing. And then he comes to this most disturbing passage, probably the darkest of this book, when he says that it's better to be stillborn. So what does he mean? A stillborn arrives empty and departs empty. And the pain of passing, this is the radical thought experiment Qohelet is going through. He's saying the pain and suffering of passing really remains only with the hopeful parents. It's an absolute tragedy for the parents, but at least the human being that would have been born never is exposed to the suffering of the world. So in a sense, the stillborn has the greatest fortune, because the stillborn ultimately is never suffering, right? The pain of utter emptiness also ultimately just befalls the parents in such a massive tragedy. But what's even more disturbing, the Qohelet is saying, is that in the end, both the stillborn and even the wealthiest among us will meet each other in the same place, which is the earth. And the great equalizer of death. How much suffering you end up being able to bear in life ultimately doesn't guarantee you or protect you or shield you from the same fate which Kohelet is concerned about, which is ultimately the great equalizer of death. If death is the great equalizer, then ultimately we have to figure out what is the key to a meaningful life. Now, Yes, Bruce.
I was just going to ask you something in regard to the stillborn. In Jewish law, um, stillborns do not have a funeral, correct? So there's no dignity, or am I wrong?
No, that's true. It's another moment where we have to ask the question, why? Why is it that already in the rabbinic period, the rabbis would not um, create or allow for a ritual to bury a stillborn and to mourn them? And that's one way of looking at it, is to say, well, how could you be so insensitive so as not to even give a stillborn the dignity of a burial? I mean, what do you think the rabbinic thinking is behind that? And then, of course, today we've we've evolved, and the truth is that there are rituals the conservative movement does for the burial of stillborns. So we've noticed, and it's actually thanks to women in the rabbinate that the rabbinate has become more compassionate and more empathic. But in the early rabbinic period, the rabbis were very concerned about giving any kind of burial rites and even naming a stillborn. And why do you think that is? What's their anxiety? Right or wrong, but I mean, what could possibly motivate um, religious people to say this does not warrant mourning, and it doesn't warrant a burial site, and it doesn't warrant a name? What do you
The
think,
only
Marion?
thing I can think about. Oh, Marion, you want to go?
Marion and then Bev, yeah.
I wonder if there's some anxiety about whether or not, if a child is stillborn, whether or not was ever a soul in the fetus, and so that you don't want to mourn something empty. I don't know if there might be some kind of sin in.
I think there's a great anxiety over that. That's definitely a big part of it, and the whole debate about abortion and when does a fetus become a living being is a huge issue of separation between the synagogue and the church, or between the church fathers and the rabbis. So, by saying that up until a certain point that the fetus is not really considered to be a living being, it may have or may not have fully developed its own identity in terms of being viable. But there is a concern about the soul and also mourning something that's empty. That's one way of looking at it. That's true. But think about it as well, that in antiquity, the mortality rate, both of the fetal mortality rate as well as the maternal mortality rate in antiquity, was so high that there was also an anxiety, right or wrong, that the rabbis had, that if a mother was able to live through birth, which wasn't always a guaranteed thing, if she was able to live through the birth, but the child died or was stillborn, there would be an anxiety that the mother and the father may end up becoming perpetual mourners and never want to try to procreate again. So it's something it's hard for us to imagine, but that's also part of where the anxiety stemmed from. And but today things have evolved in a very different way, and the conservative movement is unique among the movements, at least the non-orthodox movements, in that we have developed rituals that are sensitive to the loss that parents feel with stillborns, but also do it in a way that has integrity, that is resonant with the evolution of the law. So, Bev, what did you want to say?
Oh, well, just an observation that this child hasn't had an impact on the world. And so in a sense, early on, you just you have a sort of a non-entity. Obviously, it means a lot to the parents, but that child hasn't had any impact on the world. So it's just, you know, the child has come, but then the child disappears, so to speak.
Yeah, no, and the impact is something that's important, because when you look at the tombstone, and ultimately as well, when you talk about impact, chapter 6 in that sense is linked to chapter 7. If you look at chapter 7 verse 1, you have to read it continuously, right? The chapter 7 verse 1 is the answer to the darkness and the meaninglessness that appears in life according to Qohelet. What does Qohelet say then? Chapter 7 verse 1, it says Tov Shem Mishem and Tov B'yom Hamavet Miyom Hivaldo, right? So there's still the darkness there, but a good name and a good reputation is better than a fragrant oil, and the day of death is better than the day of birth. Now, let's leave the second part of the sentence for next week. With the first part of the sentence is suggesting that goodness in life only comes from your reputation. And as Bev just said, you only can have a reputation when you have done something in the world. So in that sense, if you look at that as being like the epithet of what lives on after you, is your reputation and your deeds. And if you have not lived a life and been able to do anything in the world, like Bev is suggesting, then it doesn't necessarily warrant the energy and the anxiety of mourning, because there was a fear of becoming a perpetual mourner. Okay, so let's go a little further and then we'll take some more questions. One of the things that happens in verses 7 through 10 is again this sense that your fate is set at birth. Now, we said that, of course, fate is not a Jewish concept, it's a Greek concept, but the idea in Qohelet that comes up and the word that's used is mikra. It means something that's going to happen, the happening, right? The event that we all experience as human beings is that we are born fated to die. That's the one thing that makes us all human and makes us all the same, no matter what socioeconomic echelon or lifestyle we lead. Ultimately, we're all going to experience, in some fashion at some point, the same event, which is death. So neither wealth nor poverty will alter or even soften that decree. That's just what it means to be human. Um, and ultimately, as a result, part of what Qohelet is pointing to is this anxiety that's beyond suffering, is that death haunts us all. And if that's what haunts us, then we think about the impermanence and the meaninglessness of life, and if that becomes a problem. So Qohelet is concerned about that because there's nothing that you can buy, there's nothing that you can barter for peace of mind out of this no exit situation of life's end. Life will eventually end. So it's not about the one who dies with the most toys wins. It's not about abstinence. It's not about asceticism. None of these things ultimately bring uh, or are able to overcome the decree of death. Um, we only ultimately have to cling or learn to live life more lightly and enter fully into the passing moment of what each moment brings or what happens without clinging on to it, whether we said last time, whether it's a moment of blessing or whether it's a moment of sorrow. When you cling too strongly and too fiercely onto a moment, that begins to precipitate the anxiety that leads us towards this ultimate confrontation with the meaninglessness of life when we confront death. So Qohelet is saying, don't hang on to those things that lead you down that road. You know where that kind of thinking leads. Don't fall into that trap. Okay, even though it's the harsh reality, that's the sobering reality that wakes us up to say, I have to make today count. I have to do something meaningful today. Be careful. Be careful not to fall into that way of thinking, because it's, even though it's true, it won't bring solace. Now, in verse 8, it's interesting. Qohelet says that see, he suggests that how well you manage to get along with people without ultimately hating them is the real question, right? Because there's the fear that Qohelet becomes misanthropic. I have a friend who who once said, a colleague who said to me once, Aubrey, I love Judaism, I just can't stand the Jews. This is a rabbinic colleague, and I thought to myself, that's an interesting thought. It's like someone who says, a philosophy professor who would say a similar thing. I love teaching the humanities, I just can't deal with teaching humans, right? And so the danger of Qohelet is that one could become very misanthropic and actually um, hate being with other people. So Qohelet is saying, well, don't allow it to get you too negative, because your ability to be able to manage it, just to manage your relationships with others, and not to allow yourself to become totally nihilistic and misanthropic, is important. But he also notices something as well. He says that a poor person's competence in dealing with others actually does that person no more good than wisdom does the wise one in dealing with people. Because the truth is it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, whether you're wise or whether you're a fool. Dealing with people is difficult, and that's a remarkable kind of observation that Qohelet makes, because you would think, well, you have all this wisdom, So if you're so wise, haven't you figured out how to deal with people yet? And Qohelet is saying, actually, the truth is that once you start getting involved with people and relationships, as we say today, it's complicated. It's complicated. Okay, so
messy.
yeah, it can be very messy. And Qohelet says, doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, whether you're wise or whether you're a fool. The nature of being engaged in relationships is complicated, even though, remember, what did Qohelet say in chapter 4? Full of paradoxes, this Qohelet. Chapter 4 was Tov Hashnayim min ha'echad, v'chut ha'meshulash lo bimhira yinatek. Two are better than one, and a three-chord cord is not easily broken. Chapter 4 speaks about the importance of friendship. Okay, but there's a difference here. I don't think it's a paradox. I think Qohelet is talking about the difference between friendship and just socializing. It's important to have another friend. You should never be radically lonely in the world, right? Always try to find a friend or a partner. That's important. And if you could find maybe two people that you really trust, that's good. You shouldn't be that vulnerable because someone can attack you and take advantage of you. But beyond that, in terms of widening your social circle and dealing with the complexities and the messiness of social relationships, well, it's like good luck because it's messy and it's complicated, right? It's a mess. And the sobriety and the irony that we see here in Qohelet, I think is quite intriguing. There is a lot of irony as well, and there's a lot of provocation. Now, this is interesting as well. Tell me what you think about verse 10. Who is the one who is more powerful than you in your life? Right? If you go back to verse 10, Qohelet says in verse 10, what was has already been called by name and is known, and it is foreknown what a human truly is, and neither can such a being contend, that is, a human being cannot contend with one more powerful. So who is this one, or what is this one that is more powerful than any human being? What is it in your own lives that you feel is more powerful than you? Is it your superior at work? Is it the partner in your relationship, or is it the creator? And the truth is that the answer is yes, right? It's
I would say the creator.
Yes.
so Bev, you would say the creator. What would other people say? What is that one thing it's more
It's all of
powerful
the
than you?
above.
All the above. So there is clearly a kind of ambivalence here. It could be all the above, as Bev is saying. It can be both the creator as well as all of the creatures that God has created who lord power over the majority of us through these different systems that we've created, right? We saw earlier on in Qohelet the cynicism of political hierarchies and the social limitations that places on freedom. Qohelet's very ambivalent about that. But there always seems to be another one who's more powerful than you, right? So don't get caught up in that. It will cause you suffering, but don't think that you're ever going to be free, because ultimately, even if you end up getting a promotion and you become the head of the CEO of your company, there's still going to be one who is more powerful than you. It's going to be a CEO who is the CEO of CEOs, and then if it's not, the number one on the Fortune 500 list, then it's ultimately going to be God. So just give up any hope that you have of being the most powerful. Our power is limited. And what does that then inculcate, which is a foreshadowing of chapter 12? If we admit that we're powerless, or at least that our power is limited, what way of living in the world might that inculcate? What quality? Maybe a sense of humility.
Well, I could give up, but also of despair. If you feel you have no impact, then well, what's the point? I don't have to try to do it,
It's true, but there's a
that
difference.
kind of thing.
I think there's a difference, though, Bev, um, between impact and power. I think it's a good point that you're making. That there is a a difference between impact.
Okay.
Sorry, folks, just a technical interruption there. But I want to just go back to what Bev was saying. Can everyone hear me still?
Yes.
Okay. So I think there's a difference between impact and power, right? You can have an impact in life without necessarily having political or social power, but you can be very impactful, right? The cliche is, of course, that character is built um, when no one else is watching, right? You can do things. Think about acts of tzedakah that either you've been the recipient of or that you have initiated on your own, where people make a huge impact in the lives of others without having, their name in lights, right? Which would give them some kind of social power or status, but you can still be impactful by being anonymous. So it's a nuance to think about, Bev. Just a nuance. I don't disagree.
Okay.
Um, let's go a little further. Verses 11 through 12. Um, the truth is, there's so many things that you can spend your day clinging to and yearning to hold on to. And what Qohelet is saying is that once you try to cling or hold on to something, it brings suffering, because clinging and yearning to hold on to something is the source of all suffering itself, right? You should never listen to friends who are telling you, buy this and you're going to feel better, because that advice only leads to more uh, obsessive consumption depression. It's a new form of OCD. It's an obsessive buying order, right? We just continue to buy things and hope that the more online shopping that we do, the happier we'll be. And we realize that the more that the boxes pile up, that we're just filled with more and more despair, because the light of truth, Qohelet is saying, cannot be purchased. Authenticity cannot be bartered for. So don't be distracted from living fully in this moment and the next moment and so on. Do right in this moment and let the rest take care of itself. Don't worry so much, right? As opposed to what Bobby McFerrin would sing, don't worry, be happy. I don't think Qohelet is saying that. I think Qohelet would be saying, don't worry, just be present. Just be present to what happens in this moment and worry less. Be more present, less worrisome. Okay. And then in the final verse, I'll just share one reflection with that. I'll put it up for some more questions. Um, again, the interesting paradox of what Qohelet is doing here could not be stronger. So if you're a plumber, let's say, okay, then wouldn't it be in your best interest to say that it's really important to have pipes in your house, right? And if you were a farmer, wouldn't you say that it's important to allow the earth to fallow, or to have oxen, or to have different forms of agrarian tools to do what needs to be done to the earth? Or if you're a dentist, wouldn't you say it would be a great thing for human beings to have teeth that need to be fixed? Or if you were a psychologist, wouldn't you say it would be a great thing for people to be mashugana, because then they could come in for therapy, right? These are all sort of assumptions we make. Whatever it is that we do in life, you would assume that you would want people to need you so that you could labor and toil, right? That would seem logical. But Kohelet is so strange, because Kohelet is a wisdom teacher who is constantly questioning the value of wisdom, right? After all, how much work would be left if there wasn't a tenure track position for philosophy professors who ultimately are there to deconstruct and dismantle the project of philosophy itself? But that's precisely actually the point of Qohelet. It may not work if you're a plumber or a farmer or a dentist, but it works in the world of thinking. As a wisdom teacher, what Qohelet is saying is that a real teacher has ultimately the humility to show the student the contours of the doorway that they're looking for, but it's the student who has to walk through the door alone, right? And as a result, um, the teacher, the true teacher, eventually has to disappear to enable true wisdom to live on in their stead. And we shouldn't confuse the teacher with wisdom itself, right? The teacher is just the channel for the wisdom, but wisdom has to live on beyond the teacher. And it's the responsibility of the teacher to ensure the teacher has students. That's the other way that Tov Hashnayim Min Ha'achad was interpreted. It wasn't just that in life two is better than one in a relationship, but Rashi and many of the rabbis say, well, what that really means, it's not about conjugal relations. It's really more about a teacher and a student to make sure that you're always teaching Torah, and that you should never be studying Torah alone, because if you do, then the Torah won't continue if you don't pass it on to someone else, right? So that's the true sign of wisdom from the perspective of Qohelet, is that ultimately the teacher will disappear and the student will continue to carry on and pass the Torah on to someone else. And ultimately, what this requires, again, is a sense of humility, right? Never presuming to know what is ultimately good for each and every singular person in their own authenticity, which really stands in stark contrast to many of the purveyors of mainline wisdom that Qohelet was competing for for the attention in the marketplace, right? Qohelet is courageous enough to swim upstream, even if the interrogation that Qohelet shares with us ultimately erodes the shoreline. And remember, in chapter 1, what does Qohelet say? Qohelet has no illusion about the impactfulness that this teacher will specifically make, even though you still must continue to teach. Qohelet then uses the same metaphor of the sea. The sea of wisdom is never full, right? Kol hanachalim holchim el hayam v'hayam eino maleh. All the tributaries flow, all the tributaries of wisdom. And Qohelet says, I'm just a tributary of wisdom. All these tributaries flow into the sea, but when you look in the sea, you realize the sea is never full. So we have a choice. Do we just abandon all hopes of trying to become wise? Or do we say, we have a stream, we have a tributary, we have an opportunity to be able to try to learn a little bit each day, try to become a little bit wiser, with the hopes of being able to pass that on to someone else, right? Sometimes a cliche that I think is important too is not just that we're talking about wisdom, but when I speak to people, I always try to understand and learn from them, not how much book learning they've done, but what can you teach me about the wisdom of experience? And part of what Qohelet is trying to impart, I would suggest, is the wisdom of experience, right? What is it that that ultimately you want to be able to pass on to those who come after you? And that is the challenge that Qohelet is posing to each of us. So how do you react to the strange paradox that Qohelet is putting before us in terms of the purpose of wisdom, the purpose of asking these questions, the purpose of taking time out of your busy days of confinement to reflect on the meaning of existence? Why is that still meaningful after Qohelet's very provocative and disturbing challenges that have been put to us in the darkest chapter of the entire book, chapter 6? And I want you to remember how deeply disturbing and dark this chapter is when we come to chapter 12, because when you get to the middle of a text in especially in the Hebrew Bible, there's an architecture to the way these texts are constructed. So the beginning, the exact middle, and the end have a kind of structural integrity and a message that's embedded within that structure. And so don't forget how dark this midpoint is relative to the opening in chapter 1 and the closure in chapter 12 that we'll look at when we get to our last session together. But what do you notice? What do you observe? How do you react to these profoundly disturbing and provocative insights? Do they resonate with you, or do they feel insincere? Do they feel damaging, or do they feel just too much to be able to absorb as a human being that wants to go and live life? Remember, Qohelet said, eat your bounty at your table, drink good wine, do everything today, because tomorrow you don't know if you're going to be around to enjoy it. And the truth is, if you leave it to somebody else, they may not have the kind of taste buds that you have. So this is a gift that God has given you. Enjoy it today. That was in our earlier chapters. So that's, don't become too despondent when you read the pessimism here. But what do you think? What do we do with what Qohelet is suggesting here? And how do you react to it? Just in your own personal life. What do you see? Marion?
It strikes me as it's a very thin sort of type of redemption. It feels very, that he's just saying it's just continuity that will carry us forward, that's the importance of passing on the Torah, and seeking wisdom in a sense is the continuity of seeking wisdom. As that, if that's our only redemption, it feels very thin. It feels
Okay.
very...
That's a good way to describe it. It's a thin vision of redemption, but maybe it's a sober vision. Maybe we should promise less and deliver more. Maybe we need to learn to manage our expectations, Qohelet is saying. But I hear you. I think it's an honest way to react to it. It does feel like a thin vision of redemption. It's definitely sobering. What else do you think? Other folks?
Well, I find that there's a little hope in the first verse, or in the first and second verses.
Mhm.
So it's in, um, or in the second one, a man whom God has given riches, wealth, and honor, and lacks nothing. Yet God did not give him the power to enjoy it. So implicit in that is, if you do enjoy, if you can enjoy what you have,
Mhm.
you're going to be okay.
And
It's just,
so what's the evil here? The evil here as well that comes in verse 1 is you've got all these gifts and you can't enjoy it.
yeah, but it doesn't. It says, and God, and I think it's accurate. I was looking at the Hebrew, and so
Yeah.
I can't appreciate all the nuances of the Hebrew. But if God doesn't let you enjoy it, but there's the implication that, well, you might be able to enjoy it.
That's right. No, and that's why Qohelet says enjoy it today.
Yeah.
Don't put it away on storage. Don't wait till you're retired. Don't wait until, don't wait on don't buy futures for wines. Buy wine you can drink now, because he says God may not grant you the time to enjoy it. A stranger will enjoy it. And when this happens, Qohelet is saying again, Zehevel v'choli ra. This is mere breath and it's an evil sickness. How could God allow this to happen? I mean, he's being very indignant and irreverent. That's something else that I want you to appreciate by the time we get to chapter 12, the complete 180 that we're going to be seeing that happens. But when we're in the midst of it, in the center of the book now, Qohelet is criticizing God or the possibility that God could be omnibenevolent and allow this to happen, that someone else is going to come and enjoy everything that you have worked your whole life to be able to enjoy, and then you sit down to have that wonderful bottle of Mouton Rothschild and you have a heart attack, God forbid. And then someone comes, your cleaner comes and enjoys the rest of the bottle of wine. I mean, Qohelet looks at that and says, this is a tragedy. And somehow God allows this to happen. How is that possible? This is just an evil sickness. He's saying that the calculus doesn't seem to always work in life. So just enjoy each moment. That's the most that you can hope for. And Qohelet is rallying out against this issue that comes up time and time again in each of the books of the wisdom texts of the Tanakh called the Ketuvim, especially especially in Qohelet, especially in Proverbs, and especially in Job and in some of the Psalms. It's the recurring question and challenge of theodicy, tzaddik v'rala, rasha v'tovlo. How is it possible that you can be righteous and then suffer? Or, as Harold Kushner put it, when bad things happen to good people, Qohelet is saying, why? Why? And it's not just when. I know it's going to happen because that's the way that the world works, and that's just evil. he's calling it out and saying it. That's just, he doesn't say it's unjust, but he says that it's evil, which is interesting. When he sees the oppressed being oppressed by their oppressors, he says, you know, that was part of what disturbed us last time when we saw that in one of the earlier chapters, and I think in chapter 5, it seems like Qohelet is in a sense suggesting we should be quietistic and not intervene when you see the poor being oppressed. But what he's really saying is that um, don't don't delude yourself into thinking that you're going to be able to change things, right? There is something evil about the way the world has been created, and there's only one force in the universe that's responsible for it. Human beings are just nasty, brutish, and their life is short, according to Hobbes. But Kohelet says, well, who created human beings, right? A creator who would create people that would do this to other people. I mean, go and critique God. Don't blame human beings for being evil. It's God who created them and evil from their youth. So it's a different way of coming to the same question that Job comes to at the end of the whirlwind in chapter 40. And God comes out of the whirlwind and says to Job, "Who are you, human being, that you should question me? Where were you when I created the world?" It's the same kind of gap and disconnect to say, ultimately, as human beings, you know, you have to just embrace the mystery, is what Job is taught by the end of 40 chapters. But Kohelet is saying, I don't need God to tell me that. I know that this is an evil experiment, and I don't like the way that it's working. I'm not going to depend on God to break this cycle under the sun, because we're here in this petri dish of an experiment, and we have to figure out a way to make it work. But when things don't work, I don't have high expectations of human beings, Kohelet is saying. You can be a fool, you can be wise, you can be rich, you can be poor, and human beings are just evil, and this experiment is evil. So try to find a way not to get too caught up in this cycle, because it will lead you to despair. But try to find small things in life that allow you to be able to enjoy what there is and not to cling too much to your suffering. Because he's also, it feels to me in many ways like a very parallel kind of a way of looking at life to the way Buddhists look at life, is that you have to somehow find a way to alleviate your attachment to suffering. And I think Kohelet is repeating that again and again, that so much of suffering in life, which is an inevitable part of being human, comes from the fact that we're too attached to it. We're attached to the things and to the experiences that cause us suffering. And if we could just learn to be a little bit more detached, like Kohelet is trying to be in his own way, or her own way. We don't know whether Qohelet is a man or a woman. That was our opening discussion in chapter 1. But Qohelet is saying, take a step back. You can't know the intricacies of the way the divine world works and the divine calculus, but you can take a step back and not become so attached to all the suffering that exists in the world. And maybe that's that's a sign of wisdom. Maybe that's what it means to be wise, is just to become a little bit less attached um, and entangled in suffering, which is inevitable. So, is that the great message of hope that you expect from a Jewish thinker? Maybe it's not as hopeful as we would like. And remember, chapter 6 is the deepest darkness of the whole book. So, don't worry, it will emerge to be a little bit lighter. Um, and we've seen there have been moments of light. But as Marion said, maybe at least in chapter 6 right now, we're at the place, at the thin crust of redemption. It's a very, very thin line, but there is still some hope. Any final observations or comments before we conclude chapter 6 together? And again, remember, we really have to end it by that first verse in chapter 7, right? The way that that this has been structured is that everything here works in clusters, and a lot of these divisions that have been made are late divisions in the way that the book was actually written. So we'll take that to heart together. But ultimately, that final phrase, who can tell a human being what will be afterwards under the sun? Ma hiye acharav tachat hashemesh, again, is the big question Kohelet has been asking throughout, pointing to, is there anything beyond this life? Right? It's still an open question from Kohelet's perspective in terms of the pshat, the contextual meaning. We've looked at a few other commentaries that suggest that, um, especially in the medieval mystical commentaries and beyond, that there is a yearning inside the words of Kohelet that that point to something more. And just to leave you with one piece of that puzzle, the Zohar in this section on Qohelet suggests the truth is it's all a mystery, and the words of King Solomon are actually clothed in other words. His words, his wisdom words, are like words of Torah, which are clothed in stories of the world. But what Qohelet is saying is just the beginning of a series of truths that are enshrouded in other stories and other cliches. And the Zohar is trying to make the claim that if you really understand Qohelet, you'll see that there is something beyond this world. There is something acharei or acharav, and that's something that we'll continue to bump up against as we go through this this interesting journey into the curious questions of Qohelet together.